Isabella sighed as she ran her fingers through her hair, glancing around the quiet living room. Life had taken an unexpected turn when she married Charles, a charming man with a son from his previous marriage. She had met Ethan briefly before the wedding, but nothing could have prepared her for the whirlwind that would follow. Ethan was 20, with a sharp wit and an attitude that tested Isabella's patience daily. He wasn't rude outright, but his subtle remarks and aloofness made it clear he wasn't thrilled about her presence in his life. She understood. Stepping into someone else's family wasn't easy for anyone involved. Still, she hoped time would smooth the edges of their strained relationship. One evening, Isabella sat on the couch with a book in hand, the soft glow of the lamp illuminating her face. She heard the front door slam, signaling Ethan's return. He had a habit of coming home late, his footsteps echoing in the quiet house. "You're back late again," Isabella said gently, looking up from her book. Ethan shrugged, tossing his bag onto the chair. "Does it matter?" She exhaled slowly, setting the book aside. "I'm not trying to control you, Ethan. I'm just worried." "Worried?" He scoffed, meeting her gaze for the first time that evening. "You barely know me. Why would you care?" Isabella felt a pang in her chest, but kept her voice calm. "Because I care about your father, and you're important to him. That makes you important to me, too." Ethan stared at her for a moment, his expression unreadable, before turning away. "Good night," he mumbled, heading upstairs. Days turned into weeks, and their interactions remained guarded. But one rainy afternoon, an unexpected opportunity arose. Charles was out of town for a business trip, and Isabella found herself alone in the house with Ethan. She had planned to spend the day quietly, but the storm outside had other ideas. A loud crash of thunder startled her, and moments later, the power went out. She fumbled for her phone, using its light to guide her to the living room. Ethan appeared at the top of the stairs, his face lit by the faint glow of his phone. "Power's out," he stated the obvious. "I noticed," Isabella replied, her tone dry. He smirked, and for the first time she caught a glimpse of amusement in his eyes. "You scared of the dark?" "No," she replied, though the unease in her voice betrayed her. Ethan descended the stairs holding a flashlight. "Come on, I'll help you find some candles." Together, they rummaged through the drawers in the kitchen, their movements awkward, yet oddly cooperative. When they finally managed to light a few candles, the house felt warmer, cozier. "You know," Ethan said as he leaned against the counter, "you're not as bad as I thought you'd be." Isabella raised an eyebrow. "Is that supposed to be a compliment?" He chuckled, and the sound surprised her. "Maybe." For the first time, they talked. Really talked. Ethan opened up about his frustrations, his struggles with his parents' divorce, and how difficult it had been to accept someone new in his father's life. Isabella listened patiently, her heart aching for the boy who had built walls around himself to protect his feelings. As the storm raged outside, the atmosphere inside the house softened. Their conversation flowed naturally, bridging the gap that had kept them apart for so long. Over the next few weeks, their dynamic shifted. Ethan no longer seemed as distant, and Isabella found herself looking forward to their interactions. There were still moments of tension, but they were fewer and far between. One evening, as they prepared dinner together, Ethan paused and looked at her thoughtfully. "You're different from what I expected," he said. "Different how?" she asked, chopping vegetables. "Better," he admitted quietly. The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest. As time went on, their bond deepened. They laughed more, shared stories, and supported each other in ways they hadn't before. Isabella realized that the key to their relationship was patience and understanding, and Ethan in turn began to see her as more than just his stepmother. Their journey was far from perfect, but it was theirs, a testament to the power of connection and the beauty of finding common ground in the most unexpected places. Isabella found herself smiling more often. The initial tension that had dominated her relationship with Ethan seemed to be fading. Their conversations grew warmer, and the house started to feel less like a battleground and more like a home. Yet, she knew their newfound connection was still fragile, like a sapling learning to stand tall against the wind. One Saturday morning, as sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, Isabella decided to break the usual routine. Charles was still out of town on another business trip, and Ethan was lounging in the living room, scrolling on his phone. "Ethan," she called from the kitchen, "want to help me with something?" "Depends. What is it?" he replied lazily, not looking up. "Baking," she said, stepping into the doorway with a mischievous smile. He raised an eyebrow. "You bake?" "Of course I do," she said, crossing her arms. "Don't act so surprised." Ethan hesitated before shrugging. "All right, why not? But don't blame me if it turns out terrible." They spent the next couple of hours in the kitchen, covered in flour and laughing at their own mistakes. Ethan insisted on experimenting with the recipe, which led to a slightly lopsided cake, but it was delicious nonetheless. "You're not half bad at this," Isabella teased as they sat at the table, enjoying the fruits of their labor. Ethan smirked, licking a bit of frosting off his finger. "You're not too bad yourself, Bella." The casual use of her nickname caught her off guard. It was the first time he'd ever called her that, and it felt natural. She didn't comment on it, but her heart swelled with a quiet happiness. As weeks turned into months, Ethan and Isabella fell into a rhythm. They had their ups and downs, but the warmth between them continued to grow. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Isabella returned home to find Ethan waiting for her in the kitchen. "Rough day?" he asked, handing her a cup of tea. She nodded, sinking into a chair. "You have no idea." He sat across from her, his expression unusually serious. "You've been working too hard. You need a break." She chuckled softly. "Is that your way of telling me I look terrible?" "No," he said quickly, his tone earnest. I think you deserve to take care of yourself, that's all." Isabella looked at him, surprised by the concern in his voice. It was a side of Ethan she hadn't seen before, a side that cared deeply, even if he didn't always show it. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, they simply sat there, the silence between them filled with unspoken understanding. One weekend, Charles announced he'd be extending his trip for another month. Isabella felt a pang of loneliness at the news, but Ethan, surprisingly, stepped in to keep her company. They started spending more time together, whether it was watching movies, cooking, or simply talking late into the night. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars, Ethan broke the silence. "You know, I didn't give you a fair chance when you first came into our lives," he admitted, his voice low. Isabella turned to him, surprised by his honesty. "I was angry," he continued, "not at you, but at the situation. I felt like my dad was moving on too quickly, and I didn't know how to deal with it. But now, I'm glad you're here." Her breath caught in her throat as she processed his words. "Thank you, Ethan," she said softly. "That means more to me than you know." Their bond had transformed into something neither of them had anticipated, a connection rooted in trust, respect, and genuine affection. They weren't just stepmother and stepson anymore. They were friends, confidants, and a source of comfort for one another. As they sat together under the starlit sky, Isabella realized that the journey they had taken, the misunderstandings, the struggles, and the moments of connection, had brought them to a place of mutual understanding and care. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and it was enough. The days seemed to blur together as winter approached, bringing colder nights and a quiet stillness to the house. One evening, Isabella was in the kitchen, wrapping up the dishes after dinner. The sound of Ethan's footsteps caught her attention, and she turned to see him standing in the doorway, his face unusually solemn. "Ethan? Everything okay?" she asked, drying her hands. He hesitated for a moment before stepping into the room. His usual confident demeanor was gone, replaced by something quieter, almost fragile. I need to talk to you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Isabella set the towel aside and motioned for him to sit at the table. He pulled out a chair but didn't sit right away, pacing instead. She waited patiently, sensing that whatever was on his mind wasn't easy for him to share. Finally, he stopped and looked at her, his eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't quite place. "I've been thinking about my mom a lot lately," he said, his voice tight. The mention of his mother wasn't something that came up often. It was a subject that had always felt like a landmine, something Isabella had tiptoed around, knowing how sensitive it was for Ethan. "I miss her," he continued, his hands clenched into fists. "Even after all this time, it still hurts, and I hate myself for feeling like I'm betraying her by getting close to you." Isabella's heart ached at his confession. She reached across the table, resting her hand gently on his. "You're not betraying her, Ethan," she said softly. "It's okay to love and miss her. She'll always be a part of you." He looked down at her hand on his jaw tightening. "I just feel so guilty, like I'm forgetting her by letting you in." "You're not forgetting her," Isabella said, her voice steady. "Loving someone new doesn't erase the love you had for her. And it's okay to feel conflicted. Grief is complicated." Ethan sat down then, his shoulders slumping as if a weight had been lifted. "I don't talk about her much," he admitted. "It's easier to just keep it buried, but sometimes it feels like I'm drowning in it." Tears welled up in Isabella's eyes as she listened. "You don't have to carry it all alone, Ethan. I'm here, and so is your dad. You can talk to us, about her, about anything. We'll always be here for you." For the first time, Ethan let his guard down completely. He talked about his mother, her laugh, her warmth, the little quirks that made her special. Isabella listened intently, holding on to every word. By the time he finished, there were tears streaming down his face. Isabella didn't hesitate. She moved to his side and wrapped her arms around him, offering silent comfort as he cried into her shoulder. "I miss her so much," he whispered. "I know," she said softly, stroking his back. "And that's okay. She'll always be with you, Ethan, in your heart and in your memories." They stayed like that for a long time, the room filled with the quiet hum of the heater and the weight of unspoken emotions. When Ethan finally pulled away, his eyes were red, but there was a sense of relief in his expression. "Thank you," he said, his voice raw but sincere. Isabella smiled gently. "Always." It was late one evening when the phone rang, breaking the peaceful silence of the house. Isabella was in the living room, curled up with a blanket, while Ethan was upstairs in his room. She glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. A call at this hour couldn't be good. "Hello?" she answered, her voice tinged with concern. "Mrs. Harper?" a deep, unfamiliar voice asked. "Yes, this is she," Isabella replied, her heart beginning to race. "This is Officer Daniels with the county police. We need to speak with Ethan Harper immediately. Is he available?" The world seemed to tilt for a moment as her grip tightened on the phone. "Ethan? Why, what's this about?" "I can't discuss details over the phone, ma'am, but it's urgent. Please let him know we're on our way to your residence." The call ended before she could press for more information. A knot formed in her stomach as she stared at the phone, her mind racing with possibilities. She hurried upstairs and knocked on Ethan's door. When he opened it, his face was pale, his expression already betraying that he knew something was wrong. "Ethan," she said, trying to steady her voice, "the police just called. They're on their way here, and they need to talk to you." He froze, his eyes widening. "What? Why?" "I don't know," she said, searching his face for answers. But they sounded serious. Ethan swallowed hard, running a hand through his hair. "It's probably about last night," he muttered under his breath. "Last night?" Isabella pressed, stepping closer. "What happened last night, Ethan?" Before he could respond, there was a loud knock at the front door. Both of them jumped, the sound reverberating through the house like a warning. "I'll handle it," Isabella said firmly, heading downstairs. She opened the door to find two uniformed officers standing there, their expressions grim. "Good evening, ma'am," the older officer said. "We need to speak with Ethan Harper immediately." "He's here," Isabella said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. "But I need to know what this is about." The officer hesitated before speaking. We're investigating an incident involving a stolen vehicle. Ethan was seen near the location last night, and we need to ask him some questions. Isabella's heart sank as she turned to look at Ethan, who had appeared at the top of the stairs. His face was a mix of fear and defiance. "Ethan, is this true?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't steal anything," he shouted, descending the stairs quickly. I was with some friends. I didn't know what they were planning." The officers exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. "Ethan," the older officer said, his tone firm but not unkind, "we're not arresting you. We just need to take you down to the station for questioning." "No," Isabella said, stepping between them and Ethan. "If he's going, I'm going with him." "Ma'am, that's not—" "Either I go with him, or you wait until his father gets back," she said, her voice sharp with determination. The officers relented, and within minutes Isabella and Ethan were in the back of a patrol car, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. At the station, Ethan sat across from an officer in a small, dimly lit room, while Isabella watched through the glass window. She felt helpless, her mind racing with worry. Inside, Ethan recounted the events of the previous night. He had gone out with some friends he'd recently made, friends Isabella had warned him about. They had been drinking, and one of them had stolen a car to show off. Ethan insisted he hadn't been involved, but the officer's questions grew sharper, pressing him for details. Hours passed, and Isabella refused to leave until they were allowed to go home. When they finally walked out of the station, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon. Ethan looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said quietly as they got into the car. "I believe you," Isabella said, starting the engine. "But Ethan, this is serious. You need to think about the people you surround yourself with. You can't keep putting yourself in situations like this." "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They drove home in silence, the weight of the night hanging over them. Back at the house, Ethan turned to her before going upstairs. "Thank you for being there. I don't think I could have handled it alone." Isabella gave him a small, tired smile. "You don't have to face things like this alone, Ethan. I'm here, no matter what." As he disappeared into his room, Isabella sank onto the couch, her mind replaying the events of the night. The suspense of it all had shaken her to her core, but it also solidified something important. Ethan needed someone who believed in him, even when the world seemed to doubt him. She was determined to be that person, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. The days following the incident at the station were tense. Ethan had withdrawn slightly, spending more time in his room than usual. Isabella gave him space, though she couldn't ignore the subtle shift in their dynamic. He had leaned on her during one of his most vulnerable moments, and it had deepened the bond between them in a way that left her both comforted and unsettled. One evening, after a quiet dinner, Ethan surprised her by lingering in the living room instead of retreating upstairs. Isabella was curled up on the couch with a blanket, flipping through a book. She looked up as he entered, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. "Of course not," she said, setting her book aside. He sat on the opposite end of the couch, the space between them both a barrier and a bridge. They didn't speak for a while, the only sound in the room coming from the soft hum of the heater. "I've been thinking," Ethan said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. "About what?" she asked, turning to face him. "About everything. About you." His words caught her off guard, and she tilted her head slightly, searching his expression for clarity. "You've been different than I expected," he continued, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I thought you were just trying to take over, like replace my mom or something, but you're not like that." "I never wanted to replace her," Isabella said softly. "I just wanted to be here for you in whatever way you needed." Ethan finally looked up, his eyes locking with hers. There was something in his gaze, an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "You're always there," he said quietly, "even when I don't deserve it." Ethan, everyone deserves someone who believes in them, she replied, her voice steady but gentle. For a moment, the air between them seemed to shift, growing heavier. He leaned back slightly, his arm resting on the back of the couch, closer to her now. Isabella was acutely aware of the space between them, or the lack thereof. "You're different," he repeated, his voice softer now. Isabella felt her pulse quicken, a warmth rising in her chest that she couldn't quite define. She searched for something to say, something to defuse the tension that had crept into the room, but words seemed to escape her. "Ethan," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. He leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable but intense. "Yeah?" Before she could respond, the sound of the clock chiming broke the moment, snapping them both out of whatever unspoken connection had been forming. Isabella stood abruptly, her heart pounding. "It's late. I should probably head to bed." Ethan nodded, his face unreadable. "Yeah, me too." She turned and walked toward the stairs, but she couldn't shake the feeling of his gaze lingering on her as she left the room. As she closed her bedroom door behind her, she leaned against it, her mind racing. Whatever had just happened between them was unexpected, uncharted territory, and it left her questioning what lay ahead for both of them. The days that followed were marked by an unspoken shift between Isabella and Ethan. Neither mentioned the charged moment in the living room, but it lingered in the air like an unfinished conversation. Small interactions, passing each other in the hallway, sharing breakfast in the kitchen, seemed to carry a newfound awareness. One rainy afternoon, while the sound of raindrops tapping against the windows filled the house, Isabella decided to tidy up the guest room. Ethan wandered downstairs, rubbing the back of his neck as he entered the room. "Need help?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. Isabella glanced up, surprised. "I wouldn't say no to an extra set of hands." He stepped inside, his tall frame making the room feel smaller. As they worked together to fold fresh linens and straighten the furniture, the quiet companionship between them felt almost comforting. "So, what's with the sudden interest in housework?" Isabella teased lightly, glancing at him. Ethan smirked, a mischievous glint in his eyes. "Maybe I'm turning over a new leaf, or maybe I'm just bored out of my mind." She laughed, shaking her head. "Either way, I'll take it." As they reached for the same corner of the bedspread, their hands brushed. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through both of them. Isabella froze for a moment, her breath catching as she looked up and met his gaze. "Sorry," Ethan murmured, though he didn't pull his hand away immediately. "It's okay," she said softly, her voice barely audible. The rain outside seemed to grow louder, filling the silence that stretched between them. Ethan's gaze held hers, his expression unreadable but intense. "You're different than anyone I've ever known," he said quietly, his tone almost vulnerable. The words caught her off guard, and she searched his face for clarity. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," he admitted, his voice low. "You see me, I guess. The real me. And that's scary, but it's also—" He trailed off, his hand finally retreating as he stepped back slightly. Isabella felt a mixture of relief and disappointment at the distance he put between them. "Ethan," she began, choosing her words carefully, "I care about you. A lot. But we need to be careful." He nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I know, I don't want to mess things up." "You won't," she said firmly, "as long as we keep being honest with each other." The tension eased slightly, though the air between them still felt charged. They finished tidying the room in silence, the unspoken understanding between them both comforting and unnerving. That evening, as Isabella sat alone in the living room with a cup of tea, she replayed the moment in her mind. She couldn't deny the connection they had, but she also knew the importance of boundaries and the need for clarity. Ethan passed by the room, pausing briefly in the doorway. "Good night, Bella," he said softly, his voice carrying a note of something unspoken. "Good night, Ethan," she replied, her heart aching with both hope and uncertainty. As he disappeared upstairs, Isabella leaned back against the couch, exhaling deeply. Whatever was happening between them, it was uncharted territory, and she wasn't sure where it would lead. The evening was quiet, the house bathed in the soft glow of dimmed lights. Isabella stood in the kitchen, rinsing the last of the dishes, her mind wandering over the whirlwind of events that had marked the past few weeks. It had been a journey of emotions, raw, unexpected, and transformative. Ethan walked in, his footsteps light but purposeful. She glanced over her shoulder, offering him a small smile. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "Not really," he admitted, leaning against the counter. "I was thinking about us." Her hands stilled under the water, and she turned to face him fully. There was a tenderness in his eyes, a softness that she hadn't seen before. "Ethan," she began, but he cut her off gently. "Let me say this," he said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "You've been there for me in ways I didn't even know I needed. You've seen the best and the worst of me, and somehow you never gave up." "I never would," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, his presence warm and grounding. "I don't know where this is going, but I know how I feel, and I know I don't want to lose what we've found." Her breath hitched as he reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. The touch was light, almost hesitant, as though he was afraid of crossing an invisible line. "I care about you, Isabella," he said, his voice soft but earnest, "more than I probably should. But it's the truth." Isabella felt her heart swell at his words. The connection between them was undeniable, a thread that had woven itself tighter with every shared moment, every glance, every touch. "I care about you too, Ethan," she said, her voice trembling with sincerity. "But this is complicated, and I want to make sure we do things the right way." He nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. "I'll follow your lead. I just want you to know how much you mean to me." For a moment, they stood in the stillness of the kitchen, the world outside fading into irrelevance. Slowly, he leaned in, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Isabella's breath caught as his lips brushed against hers, a gentle, tender kiss that spoke of trust, hope, and the promise of something more. When they pulled back, their foreheads rested against each other, both of them smiling softly. "We'll figure this out," Isabella said, her voice steady. "Together," Ethan agreed. As the rain began to patter softly against the windows, they stayed in each other's presence, their hearts aligned in a way that felt both natural and extraordinary. It wasn't the end, it was a beginning, one filled with uncertainty but also with endless possibility.